The February rain in Boston fell like bullets, cold and relentless, turning the city's historic streets into rivers of dirty slush that reflected neon signs and fractured rainbows. Dante Moretti adjusted the collar of his cashmere coat as he stepped from the black Escalade, his breath visible in the frigid air, and nodded once to Marcus, his head of security. The meeting had run long. 3 hours of negotiating territory disputes with the Russo family, their youngest son pushing boundaries that would need to be corrected soon, preferably before correction became elimination. At 34, Dante had spent the last 6 years running the Moretti operations with the kind of calculated precision his father had never managed, transforming street-level enforcement into an empire that touched everything from construction contracts to the shipping lanes that fed New England's appetite for goods that never appeared on customs forms. But tonight, exhaustion pulled at him with fingers that felt like lead. Not the physical tiredness that came from violence or long negotiations, but the soul-deep weariness of a man who'd been searching for something lost for 3 years, 2 months and 17 days. Not that he was counting. The charity gala had been Eleanor's idea originally. She believed in using their wealth to fund children's programs, her way of balancing the darkness of his world with light she insisted could exist alongside it. After she disappeared, Dante had continued the tradition, partly because the organizations genuinely helped kids who reminded him too much of his own childhood, and partly because walking away from anything Eleanor had cared about felt like admitting she was never coming back. The ballroom of the Fairmont Copley Plaza glittered with Boston's elite. Old money mingling carefully with new money, politicians shaking hands with businessmen whose legitimate ventures barely concealed the criminal operations that actually funded their lifestyles. Dante moved through the crowd with practiced ease, his smile never reaching eyes that constantly scanned for threats, for opportunities, for the ghost of a woman who'd vanished from a supermarket parking lot while he'd been across town eliminating a rival who'd threatened their territory. The guilt tasted like copper on his tongue, metallic and permanent. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The silent auction tables lined the ballroom's perimeter, displaying prizes that ranged from vacation packages to private dinners with local celebrities. Dante paused at a table, showcasing a weekend at a vineyard in Tuscany, remembering how Eleanor had always wanted to visit Italy, to see the villages where his grandparents had been born before immigrating to Boston's North End with nothing but determination and a willingness to do whatever survival required. "Mr. Moretti!" A voice cut through his reverie, and he turned to find Margaret Shin, the foundation's director, approaching with a woman whose exhaustion was visible despite expensive makeup, and a dress that had probably cost a month's rent for most people in the city. "I'd like you to meet Dr. Sarah Bennett. She runs the pediatric clinic in Dorchester that we've been funding." Dante extended his hand automatically, his practiced charm engaging even as his mind remained elsewhere. Dr. Bennett's handshake was firm despite the tremor he felt in her fingers, and her eyes held the kind of weariness that came from witnessing suffering she couldn't always prevent. "The Foundation's support has been transformative," Dr. Bennett said, her voice carrying genuine gratitude beneath professional formality. "We've been able to expand services to neighborhoods that haven't had adequate pediatric care in decades." They talked for several minutes about clinic operations, about the challenges of providing health care in communities where poverty and violence created cycles that crushed children before they had chances to escape. Dante listened with attention that would have surprised people who only knew him as the cold enforcer who'd consolidated Moretti power through strategic brutality. The conversation was interrupted by commotion near the ballroom's entrance. Nothing dramatic, just a subtle shift in the crowd's energy that made Dante's instincts flare with warning honed through years of surviving in a world where distraction often preceded attack. A child stood just inside the doorway, small and out of place among the evening gowns and tuxedos. She couldn't have been more than 7 years old, with dark hair plastered to her skull from the rain and a coat that had been nice once but now bore the unmistakable signs of poverty's slow erosion. Her eyes swept the room with desperation that made something twist in Dante's chest, recognition of fear he'd seen too many times in too many contexts. Security was already moving toward her, the hotel staff probably planning to escort her out before she disturbed the wealthy patrons who preferred poverty remain invisible during their charitable events. But the girl's gaze locked onto Dante across the crowded ballroom, and she moved toward him with purpose that defied her small size and obvious terror. People parted without conscious thought, their instincts responding to something in the child's intensity that demanded passage. Dante watched her approach, his mind cataloging details automatically. The way she favored her left leg slightly, suggesting an injury or chronic pain. The defensive hunch of her shoulders that spoke of expecting violence from adults who should protect. The determination in her expression that reminded him painfully of Eleanor, who'd never backed down from anything despite being half his size and possessing none of his capacity for brutality. The girl stopped directly in front of him, tilting her head back to meet his gaze with courage that children shouldn't need to develop. Her lips trembled, whether from cold or fear he couldn't determine, but her voice emerged steady when she spoke. "Mr. Moretti," she whispered, the sound somehow cutting through the ballroom's ambient noise with clarity that made his blood run cold. "I know where your wife is." The world stopped. The music continued playing. The crowd kept moving around them. But Dante felt reality narrow to the space between him and this child who'd just spoken words he'd been desperate to hear for over 3 years. His hand shot out. Gripping her shoulder with intensity, he immediately forced himself to moderate, aware he was probably terrifying her but unable to control the surge of adrenaline flooding his system. Marcus materialized at his elbow, reading the situation with the efficiency that made him invaluable, already creating a subtle barrier between them and curious observers who'd noticed the interaction. "What did you say?" Dante's voice emerged as a growl, rough with emotions he'd spent years learning to suppress. He dropped to one knee, bringing himself to the girl's eye level, ignoring the expensive fabric of his tuxedo pants, soaking up water that dripped from her worn coat. "Say it again." The child's eyes filled with tears as she fought visibly, her small jaw clenching with determination that was heartbreaking in someone so young. "I know where Mrs. Eleanor is," she repeated, her voice cracking on the name. "The lady with the pretty smile in the pictures. She's hurt, and she needs help. And I heard you were the only one who could help her because you're her husband and you're powerful and... Where?" The word came out as a command, Dante's hands gripping both her shoulders now, trembling with the effort of not shaking answers from her. "Where is she?" The girl glanced around the ballroom, overwhelmed by the attention they were attracting despite Marcus's attempts at containment. "I can show you," she whispered, her small hand reaching out to clutch the lapel of his jacket with fingers that felt ice-cold even through the layers of expensive fabric. "But we have to hurry. The bad men, they check on her every night, and if they find out I told anyone..." She didn't finish the sentence, but Dante understood the implication with sickening clarity. This child had risked something to come here, to find him, to deliver information that could either be salvation or the cruelest manipulation he'd ever encountered. "Marcus," Dante said without looking away from the girl's face, "clear the room. I don't care what excuses you make. I need everyone who isn't Foundation staff out of this ballroom in the next 3 minutes." "Boss, this could be a setup," Marcus said quietly, his hand moving inside his jacket toward the weapon Dante knew was holstered there. "The timing, the public location, a kid as the messenger, it's too convenient." "I don't care." Dante stood, lifting the girl into his arms in one smooth motion despite her startled gasp. She weighed almost nothing, her small body shivering violently against his chest, and he felt rage ignite alongside the desperate hope that was probably going to destroy him. "If there's even a 1% chance this is real, I'm taking it. Now clear the room and get 3 cars ready. Full tactical team. We leave in 5 minutes." The ballroom erupted into controlled chaos as Marcus issued rapid orders through his earpiece, security personnel materializing from positions Dante hadn't consciously noted but knew were always present. Margaret Chin was protesting about the disruption, about the donors who needed to be managed, but her voice faded into background noise as Dante carried the girl toward a private sitting room off the main ballroom. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice gentling with effort that cost more than any negotiation he'd conducted. The child had stopped shaking quite so violently, her small arms wrapped around his neck with trust that felt both precious and terrifying. "Sophia," she whispered against his shoulder. "Sophia Martinez. My mama, she's..." Her voice broke, and Dante felt wetness seeping through his shirt that had nothing to do with rain. "It's okay," he heard himself say, the reassurance emerging automatically despite having no authority to promise anything would be okay. Whatever's happened, whatever you're scared of, I'm going to fix it. But I need you to tell me everything you know about Eleanor. About where she is, and who has her. The sitting room was empty, its elegant furniture and soft lighting providing backdrop for a conversation that felt surreal. Dante sat on an antique sofa, settling Sophia beside him but keeping one hand on her shoulder anchoring them both. Marcus entered with two other members of his security team, their expressions grim but professional, weapons visible now that they'd moved out of public view. Sophia's story emerged in fragments, interrupted by tears and trembling that spoke of trauma too fresh to have scarred over yet. Her mother had been working as a housekeeper for a family in Brookline, one of Boston's wealthy suburbs where old money maintained estates that looked like something from a different century. 3 months ago, Sophia's mother had discovered something in the house's basement. A woman, injured and confused, locked in a room that had been converted into a cell. Mama said she looked like the lady from the news, Sophia whispered, her fingers twisted in the fabric of Dante's jacket. From years ago, when everyone was looking for the missing woman whose husband owned restaurants and things. She wanted to call the police, but the man who lives there, Mr. Richard, he caught her before she could. Dante's jaw clenched so hard he felt his teeth grind together, rage building in his chest with volcanic intensity. What happened to your mother? Sophia's face crumpled, years of forced maturity collapsing under the weight of fear too large for her small body. He said if she told anyone, he'd hurt me. So Mama kept working there, kept cleaning around the lady in the basement, and sometimes she'd sneak her extra food or water when Mr. Richard wasn't watching. But last week, her voice broke completely, sobs racking her thin frame. Last week what? Sophia, Dante asked, his voice rough with emotions he couldn't name, his hand stroking her damp hair with the kind of gentleness that felt foreign to fingers more accustomed to violence. Last week Mama got sick, Sophia managed through her tears. Really sick, like burning up and coughing blood. Mr. Richard said she was useless and he'd find someone else. He told us to leave, but Mama was too sick to walk, and I didn't know what to do. She kept saying I had to find you, that you were the only one who could save the lady in the basement, that you'd help us if I could just get to you. The pieces assembled in Dante's mind with sickening clarity. Richard Castellano, old money family that had been part of Boston's social elite for generations, their fortune built on shipping and real estate before those industries had legitimate foundations. He'd been on Dante's radar for years as someone operating on the periphery of the criminal world, facilitating transactions, but never getting his own hands dirty. The bastard had been holding Eleanor for 3 years. 3 years, while Dante had torn the city apart looking for her, while he'd eliminated rivals and informants and anyone who might have information, while he'd slowly lost pieces of himself to the kind of grief that calcified into something darker and more consuming than simple sadness. Marcus, Dante said, his voice carrying the kind of cold certainty that made his security chief straighten instinctively. Pull everything we have on Richard Castellano. Address, security systems, staff schedules, everything. And get Dr. Bennett in here. If Sophia's mother is that sick, she's going to need immediate medical attention. Boss, if this is a trap, Marcus started, but Dante cut him off with a look that could have frozen blood. If it's a trap, then someone's about to learn exactly why people are terrified of crossing the Moretti family, Dante said softly, the threat all the more menacing for its quiet delivery. But this child is telling the truth. I can feel it. What he didn't say, what he couldn't articulate even to himself, was that he needed it to be true with desperation that bordered on madness. 3 years of searching, of investigating, of throwing money and resources at a mystery that had remained frustratingly unsolvable. 3 years of guilt eating at him like acid, the knowledge that Eleanor had disappeared while he'd been enforcing his will on the city, that her last thoughts might have been wondering why he wasn't there to protect her. Dr. Bennett arrived within minutes, her professional concern evident as she knelt beside Sophia, checking the girl for injuries while asking gentle questions about her mother's symptoms. The diagnosis wasn't good, pneumonia that had progressed to a dangerous stage without treatment, probably complicated by malnutrition and the stress of their situation. She needs immediate hospitalization, Dr. Bennett said, her expression grave. If she's been coughing blood for a week, we're talking about potential lung damage that could be fatal without intervention. Then we get her, Dante said, standing with the kind of predatory grace that made Sophia's eyes widen slightly. He'd been trying to moderate his intensity, to not terrify the child who'd risked everything to find him, but the rage building in his chest was becoming impossible to contain. Sophia, I need you to do something very brave for me. I need you to show me exactly where this house is, where your mother is, and where they're keeping Eleanor. Can you do that? Sophia nodded, her small face set with determination that reminded him painfully of Eleanor's refusal to back down from anything, no matter how intimidating the opposition. I can show you. But Mr. Richard, he has guns. And men who work for him. Mama said they hurt people who cause problems. Good, Dante said with a smile that would have terrified anyone who understood what it meant. I'm about to cause a lot of problems. The drive to Brookline took 20 minutes through streets that gleamed with rain and reflected the city's lights and patterns that looked almost beautiful if you didn't know the darkness that existed beneath Boston's historic charm. Sophia sat between Dante and Marcus in the back of the lead Escalade, her small body rigid, with tension as they approached the address she'd provided. The Castellano estate sat behind iron gates that were more decorative than defensive, the kind of security that announced wealth but wouldn't stop anyone serious about breaching the perimeter. Dante studied the property through bulletproof windows, his mind cataloging entry points and vulnerabilities with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd conducted more raids than he could count. Thermal shows 7 people inside, Marcus reported, checking the tablet that displayed real-time imaging from the drone one of their tech specialists had deployed. 2 in the main house, 2 in what looks like servant quarters, and 3 in the basement level, probably where they're keeping the women. I want this surgical, Dante said, his hand resting on Sophia's shoulder with gentleness that contrasted sharply with the violence in his voice. No one dies unless they make it necessary. I need Castellano alive long enough to explain exactly what he's been doing with my wife for 3 years. The assault was executed with precision that came from years of operations where failure meant death. Dante's team breached the gates silently, disabling the security system with equipment that cost more than most people's houses, and infiltrated the mansion through entry points their surveillance had identified. Dante went straight for the basement with Sophia clutching his hand, her directions whispered in the darkness, as they navigated stairs that descended into the kind of space that looked innocuous until you understood what it had been used for. The door at the bottom was reinforced steel, locked with an electronic system that Marcus bypassed in less than 30 seconds, and then they were through. The basement had been converted into something that made Dante's stomach turn. Clean, climate-controlled, with furniture that looked like it belonged in a comfortable apartment rather than a prison. But the woman sitting on the bed, staring at them with eyes that didn't quite focus, had been captive here long enough that she probably couldn't remember what freedom looked like. Eleanor. She'd changed. Her dark hair, always meticulously styled, hung limp around a face that had lost the softness he remembered. She was thinner, her cheekbones sharp beneath skin that looked almost translucent, and her eyes, those green eyes that had convinced him he could be more than the violence his family expected, held confusion and fear that gutted him more effectively than any physical wound. Eleanor, he breathed, her name emerging like a prayer despite not having believed in anything divine since childhood. Jesus Christ, Eleanor, it's me. It's Dante. She blinked, her expression cycling through emotions too quickly for him to track. Dante! Her voice was raspy, unused to speaking or damaged from screaming no one had bothered to hear. You're not. This isn't. She pressed her hands to her temples, her breathing accelerating into the kind of panic attack that suggested psychiatric damage beyond the obvious physical captivity. No. You're not real. He said you were dead. He said you'd been killed and no one was coming, and I just had to accept. Dante crossed the space in 3 strides, dropping to his knees beside the bed and reaching for her with hands that trembled despite years of training himself to remain steady under any circumstances. I'm real, Eleanor. I swear to God, I'm real, and I've been looking for you every single day since you disappeared. Baby, please look at me. Really look at me. Her hands touched his face hesitantly, fingers tracing features she'd known intimately, and he watched recognition dawn alongside tears that broke something fundamental in his chest. "Dante!" she sobbed, her arms suddenly around his neck, her body shaking violently. He said, "Richard said you'd moved on, that you'd given up looking, that I'd been forgotten." "Never," Dante said fiercely, his own tears falling freely now despite Marcus and Sophia and his entire team witnessing the collapse of walls he'd spent decades building. "Not for 1 second did I stop looking. Not for 1 moment did I forget you." Above them, the sounds of a struggle filtered down through the ceiling, Castellano being apprehended, his security team neutralized with the efficiency that made Dante's operations legendary in Boston's criminal underworld. But in the basement, in that horrible room that had been Eleanor's entire world for 3 years, there was only reunion. Only the desperate clutch of 2 people who'd been torn apart by violence and calculated cruelty, who'd survived on hope that had grown thinner with each passing day. Sophia appeared at Dante's elbow, her small face wet with tears. "Mama's in the room next door," she whispered. Can we get her now?" Eleanor's head turned toward the girl, confusion evident in her expression. "Sophia, baby, what are you doing here?" "It's not safe. She came to find me," Dante said, lifting Eleanor carefully despite her protests about being able to walk. Her weight in his arms felt simultaneously too light and exactly right, and he pressed his lips to her forehead with reverence usually reserved for holy relics. "She saved you, Eleanor. This brave little girl risked everything to tell me where you were." The next room contained Sophia's mother, unconscious, and burning with fever that had progressed to the dangerous stage Dr. Bennett had predicted. Dante barked orders to his team, coordination rapid. Extraction that would get both women to the private hospital where he'd maintained a permanent floor specifically for situations requiring discretion alongside excellent medical care. Richard Castellano was being held in his own study upstairs, zip-tied to a chair with efficiency that spoke of practice, when Dante carried Eleanor past. The older man's face was bloody from where he tried to fight back, and his expression cycled between terror and outrage as he took in the scene, his prisoner being rescued, his operation exposed, his entire world about to collapse around him. "You can't do this!" Castellano shouted, his voice breaking with panic. "Do you know who I am? My family. Your family is about to learn exactly what happens when someone touches what's mine," Dante said, his voice carrying the kind of cold certainty that made Castellano's face drain of remaining color. He didn't stop walking, didn't waste energy on threats that would be executed regardless of whether they were spoken aloud. Eleanor needed medical attention, and everything else could wait. The drive to the hospital passed in a blur of sirens, and Marcus coordinating with their medical contacts, ensuring everything would be prepared when they arrived. Eleanor had lapsed into semi-consciousness, her body finally surrendering to exhaustion now that immediate danger had passed, and Dante held her with desperate gentleness, murmuring reassurances he wasn't sure she could hear. Sophia sat beside them, her small hand clutching Eleanor's with fierce protectiveness, and Dante made silent promises about the future he would provide for this brave child who'd somehow found the courage to trust a stranger with her most dangerous secret. The night that had started with a charity gala and exhaustion had transformed into something that felt like being reborn, like emerging from 3 years of darkness into painful, brilliant light that hurt to look at directly but was worth every moment of discomfort. Eleanor was alive. Against all probability, against 3 years of searching and failing and slowly losing hope, she was alive and in his arms and heading toward safety. The guilt would come later, the knowledge that she'd been suffering while he'd been living, that every moment of his continued existence had been happening while she'd been locked in that basement. But for now, there was only relief, so profound it felt religious, and the weight of a child's hand in his as they raced through Boston's night toward whatever came next. The private hospital's top floor belonged to Dante Moretti and everything but the paperwork that carefully obscured his ownership through shell corporations and legitimate business fronts. The entire level had been designed for situations requiring absolute discretion, politicians recovering from indiscretions, criminals needing surgery without police reports, and now, his wife returning from 3 years of captivity that had left scars both visible and hidden beneath skin that had once been smooth and unmarked. Eleanor had been unconscious for 18 hours, her body finally surrendering to the exhaustion that captivity and constant vigilance had prevented. The doctors had run tests that revealed malnutrition, vitamin deficiencies that bordered on scurvy, and psychological trauma that would require months, if not years, of careful treatment. But she was alive, breathing steadily under medical supervision that monitored every heartbeat and respiration, and Dante sat beside her bed like a man keeping vigil at a shrine. Sophia's mother, Gabriella, occupied the room next door. The pneumonia that had nearly killed her was responding to aggressive antibiotic treatment, though the doctors warned that the damage to her lungs might be permanent, a consequence of weeks without medical intervention, while she tried desperately to protect her daughter from a monster who'd seen them as expendable labor. Sophia herself had refused to leave the floor, her small body curled in a chair between the two rooms, keeping watch over both women with the kind of vigilance that children shouldn't need to develop. Dante had ordered one of his security team, a woman named Teresa, who had training in child psychology alongside her weapon certifications, to stay with Sophia, ensuring the girl ate and slept and felt safe for probably the first time in months. The city outside the hospital windows was waking to news that would dominate every media outlet by noon. Richard Castellano, scion of one of Boston's oldest families, had been arrested in a dramatic raid that local news was struggling to report accurately without understanding the criminal dimensions underlying the official story. The FBI had taken jurisdiction after Dante's careful manipulation ensured federal charges that would put Castellano away for decades, preventing any possibility of local connections securing his release. But the official narrative, that Castellano had been running a human trafficking operation that kidnapped women for wealthy clients, carefully omitted Eleanor's identity and Dante's involvement in her rescue. As far as the public would know, this was law enforcement successfully dismantling a criminal enterprise, not a mafia boss reclaiming his stolen wife through violence that had left 3 of Castellano's men hospitalized. Marcus entered the room quietly, his footsteps barely audible on the hospital's expensive flooring, and Dante looked up from where he'd been, watching Eleanor's chest rise and fall with a steady rhythm that meant she was still breathing, still alive, still his despite 3 years of believing he'd failed to protect her. "The Castellano family is trying to arrange bail," Marcus reported, his voice pitched low enough not to disturb Eleanor's sleep. "Federal prosecutor says they're claiming Richard is being framed, that this is a vendetta from criminal organizations trying to damage their reputation." Dante's laugh was bitter, completely devoid of humor. Their reputation was built on shipping opium in the 1920s and laundering money through real estate developments that displaced entire neighborhoods. But kidnapping and imprisoning women crosses a line that even criminals have. "Public doesn't know the history," Marcus said pragmatically. "They see old money family being attacked by the justice system, and their instinct is to defend the establishment against outside threats." "Then we need to control the narrative," Dante said, his mind already working through the problem with the strategic thinking that had made him Boston's most effective power broker. "Leak the evidence to the press. Photos of the basement prison, medical records showing Eleanor's condition, testimony from Gabriella about what she witnessed. Make it impossible for anyone to defend him without looking complicit. Boss, that exposes Eleanor to media attention that might not be what she needs right now," Marcus cautioned, and Dante felt the words land like physical blows because the security chief was absolutely right about the secondary trauma that public scrutiny would inflict. "Then we leak everything except her identity," Dante said after a moment of painful deliberation. "The photos can show the room without showing Eleanor. Gabriella's testimony can describe what she witnessed without naming the victim. We destroy Castellano's reputation without making Eleanor into a circus sideshow for the city's entertainment." Marcus nodded, already pulling out his phone to coordinate with the team of lawyers and PR specialists that Dante kept on permanent retainer for exactly these situations. The Moretti family survival had always depended on controlling information as much as controlling territory, and this crisis required both skills deployed with precision that left no room for error. Eleanor stirred in the bed, her eyes fluttering open with the kind of confused disorientation that came from waking in unfamiliar places. Her gaze found Dante immediately, and he watched relief and fear war across her features. Relief that he was real, that yesterday hadn't been a fever dream conjured by a mind breaking under captivity's weight, but also fear of what came next, of whether the man she'd known still existed beneath 3 years of absence, and whatever he'd become without her presence to moderate his darker impulses. "Hey," Dante said softly, his hand finding hers with gentleness that contrasted sharply with the violence those same fingers had inflicted on Castellano's men. "How are you feeling?" Eleanor's laugh was hoarse, painful to hear. "Like I've been locked in a basement for 3 years while my husband was—" She stopped, her expression crumpling. "God, Dante, where were you? Why didn't you find me? I thought, he said you'd given up looking, that you'd moved on, that I was—" "Every word he told you was a lie," Dante interrupted, his voice rough with emotions that threatened to overwhelm carefully maintained control. "Not one day passed when I wasn't searching. Not one moment when I accepted that you were gone. I tore the city apart looking for you, Eleanor. I became—" He stopped, unwilling to admit exactly what he'd become in her absence, the violence and ruthlessness that had escalated beyond even his father's brutal standards. Eleanor's fingers tightened around his, her green eyes searching his face with intensity that made him feel exposed in ways he'd spent years learning to avoid. "You look different," she whispered. "Harder. Older." 3 years changes people," Dante said, the understatement vast enough to be almost funny if anything about the situation could be considered humorous. "I'm sorry I didn't find you sooner." "I'm sorry." "Stop," Eleanor said, her free hand reaching up to touch his face with fingers that trembled. "Stop apologizing for something that wasn't your fault. Richard, he planned it perfectly, Dante. He watched me for weeks, learned my routines, waited until you were dealing with the Russo situation that day. He knew exactly when to take me, so that no one would witness it." The information settled in Dante's stomach like lead, confirmation that Castellano's actions had been premeditated rather than opportunistic, that he'd studied Dante's operation carefully enough to identify the exact vulnerability in his security. The rage that accompanied this understanding was volcanic, barely contained beneath the facade of calm he maintained for Eleanor's sake. "Why?" Dante asked, the question that had been consuming him since Sophia had spoken those impossible words. "Why did he take you? Was it ransom? Revenge for some business dispute I don't remember?" Eleanor's expression darkened, her gaze sliding away from his toward the window where morning light was beginning to strengthen. "He said—" Her voice cracked, and Dante waited with patience that cost everything, knowing she needed to tell this story at her own pace. "He said I was insurance. That as long as he had me you couldn't move against him on the waterfront development deal. The one where you were blocking his expansion into the North End." Memory crystallized with sickening clarity. 3 years ago, Castellano had been trying to gentrify Dante's childhood neighborhood, purchasing buildings from elderly residents who didn't understand that selling to his development company meant displacement that would scatter communities that had existed for generations. Dante had used his influence to block the deals, to ensure the old guard who'd known his grandparents could remain in homes they'd lived in for decades. It had seemed like a minor territorial dispute at the time, barely worth the energy he devoted to thwarting Castellano's plans. But apparently, to a man accustomed to getting everything he wanted through money and inherited privilege, Dante's interference had been intolerable enough to justify kidnapping and 3 years of imprisonment. "He kept me alive as leverage," Eleanor continued, her voice strengthening slightly as she forced herself through the explanation. "Said that if you ever came after him directly, if you ever crossed certain lines, he'd kill me and make sure you knew it was your fault. He'd show me newspapers, articles about your business operations, constantly reminding me that my captivity was the price of your freedom to operate." The psychological torture of that revelation, being made to believe that her suffering was somehow protecting Dante, that her captivity served a purpose beyond Castellano's twisted need for control, made Dante want to drive back to the federal holding facility where Castellano was being detained and finish what his team had started in that mansion study. "I'm going to kill him," Dante said, the words emerging with flat certainty that made Eleanor's eyes widen. "Not today, maybe not this month, but eventually, I'm going to ensure Richard Castellano understands exactly what happens when someone touches what's mine." "Dante, no," Eleanor protested, struggling to sit up despite the 4 lines and monitoring equipment that tethered her to the bed. "That's exactly what he wanted, to turn you into the monster he kept telling me you were. To prove that underneath all your talk about honor and family loyalty, you're just another criminal who solves problems with violence." I am that criminal, Dante said, the admission tasting like ash but necessary for Eleanor to understand who she'd married, who he'd become fully in her absence. I always have been, Eleanor. You knew that when you agreed to be my wife. The only difference is that for 3 years, I've had nothing moderating that violence. Nothing reminding me that there are lines that shouldn't be crossed. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The door opened before Eleanor could respond, and Dr. Sarah Chun entered with her tablet and professional expression that had been carefully trained to reveal nothing about the extraordinary nature of her patients. She'd been treating Moretti family members for years, understanding that discretion was more valuable than whatever moral concerns she might have about the source of injury she documented. "How's our patient feeling this morning?" Dr. Chin asked. Her voice warmed despite the clinical assessment happening behind her eyes as she reviewed Eleanor's vital signs on the monitors. "Like I've been hit by a truck," Eleanor said, managing a weak smile that didn't reach her eyes. "But alive, which is apparently more than I should expect given the circumstances." Dr. Chin began her examination with practiced efficiency, asking questions about pain levels and checking reflexes, while Dante retreated to the window to give them space. But his attention never fully left Eleanor, his awareness of her presence, so acute it felt like a physical connection that distance couldn't diminish. "Your physical recovery should progress well with proper nutrition and rest," Dr. Chun said after completing her assessment. "The vitamin deficiencies will correct with supplementation, and the muscle atrophy will improve with physical therapy. But Mrs. Moretti, I need to be direct with you about the psychological impact of prolonged captivity." Eleanor's face closed off, while slamming into place with speed that suggested she'd spent 3 years perfecting emotional defenses. "I'm fine," she said, the lie so transparent that even Dante, who'd spent years reading people for survival, could see through it immediately. "With respect, you're not fine," Dr. Chun said gently but firmly. "No one could be fine after what you've endured. Post-traumatic stress is a medical condition, not a weakness or something you can simply willpower your way through. I'd like to refer you to a colleague who specializes in trauma recovery, someone who has experience with women whose husbands run criminal organizations." Eleanor asked, her tone sharp with the kind of defensive anger that came from feeling exposed. "Someone who can help me process the fact that I was imprisoned as collateral damage in a mob war I never asked to be part of." The accusation hung in the air between them, and Dante felt it land with precision that suggested Eleanor had been composing variations of his confrontation throughout her captivity. She wasn't wrong. Her involvement in his world had been voluntary initially, but the consequences had never been something she could have fully anticipated or consented to. Dr. Chen excused herself with the kind of tactical retreat that medical professionals perfected, leaving them alone with tension that felt heavy enough to suffocate. Dante turned from the window, studying Eleanor's face with intensity that made her shift uncomfortably against the hospital pillows. "You're angry with me," he said, the observation stating the obvious but necessary to begin a conversation they'd been avoiding since her rescue. "I don't know what I am," Eleanor admitted, her voice cracking with exhaustion that went beyond physical. "Grateful that you found me? Furious that it took 3 years? Terrified about what happens now? I spent every day in that basement imagining our reunion, planning what I'd say to you, but now that you're here I don't know." She broke off, tears streaming down her face with the kind of complete emotional collapse that Dante had been expecting but hoping to delay. He crossed to the bed in 3 strides, pulling her into his arms with desperate need to provide comfort he had no idea how to actually offer. "I'm sorry," he murmured into her hair, the words inadequate for the enormity of what she'd endured but the only thing he knew how to say. "I'm so goddamn sorry, Eleanor. For every moment you spent in that basement. For every time you wondered if I'd given up looking. For bringing you into my world without fully preparing you for what that might cost." Eleanor sobbed against his chest, her small body shaking with grief and rage and relief tangled together so completely that separating them seemed impossible. Dante held her through it, ignoring the nurse who entered briefly before retreating when she saw them, ignoring Marcus's message about urgent business requiring his attention, ignoring everything except the woman in his arms who'd survived hell and somehow still existed despite Richard Castellano's attempts to break her. They stayed like that for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, until Eleanor's tears subsided into exhausted silence, and she pulled back slightly to look at him with red-rimmed eyes that held questions he dreaded answering. "What happened to you while I was gone?" she asked quietly. "Marcus looks at you differently now. There's fear there that wasn't present before. What did you become, Dante?" The truth would hurt her, but lies would destroy whatever chance they had at rebuilding trust that 3 years of separation and trauma had damaged beyond easy repair. "I consolidated power in ways that made my father's reign look gentle," Dante said, forcing himself to meet her gaze despite the shame crawling up his throat. "I eliminated rivals who'd existed peacefully alongside the Moretti family for decades because I needed absolute control to search for you effectively. I corrupted officials who'd been resisting our influence because I needed access to every database and surveillance system in the city. I became—" He stopped, searching for words that wouldn't sound like excuses. "I became exactly what everyone always feared the Morettis could be if we stopped pretending to have boundaries." Eleanor's face paled, her hands trembling where they rested against his chest. "How many people died because of me?" "None of them died because of you," Dante said fiercely, gripping her shoulders with intensity that made her wince slightly. "They died because they stood between me and information I needed. They died because the city's criminal ecosystem required restructuring for me to have the resources necessary to search everywhere you might be. They died because I chose to prioritize finding you over maintaining whatever illusion of honor I'd been trying to cultivate." "That's not better, Dante," Eleanor whispered, pulling away from him with a kind of physical retreat that hurt worse than any wound he'd ever sustained. "That's not something I can. I don't know how to process that people are dead because you were looking for me. That's not— I can't." She was hyperventilating now, her breathing accelerating into panic attack territory that made the monitors start alarming. Dr. Chen rushed back in with a nurse, both moving with practiced efficiency to administer medication that would calm Eleanor's nervous system without sedating her completely. Dante retreated to the corner of the room, watching helplessly as medical professionals handled a crisis he created through honesty that was apparently more than Eleanor could handle. Marcus appeared at his elbow, having been monitoring from outside, and guided him into the hallway with gentle but firm pressure. "You need to give her space," Marcus said quietly. "She's been through hell, boss. She can't process your hell on top of her own right now." "She asked," Dante said, the words emerging defensively because he didn't know what else to say, how else to justify the damage he'd just inflicted with truth that maybe should have waited. "She asked because she needed to understand what she's returning to," Marcus said. "But that doesn't mean she was ready to hear it. You've had 3 years to become what you are now. She's had 18 hours to process being rescued. The timelines don't match, and pushing her to catch up is only going to drive her away." The observation landed with uncomfortable accuracy, and Dante leaned against the hallway wall, feeling exhaustion that had been held at bay by adrenaline finally catching up with him. When was the last time he'd slept? Before the gala, so at least 36 hours ago. His body was protesting the continued stress with tremors and nausea he'd learned to ignore through years of pushing past physical limitations. "Go see the girl," Marcus suggested. "Sophia's been asking about you. She wants to know if her mother is going to be okay, and I think hearing it from you would mean more than hearing it from medical staff she doesn't know." Dante nodded, grateful for a concrete task that didn't require navigating emotional complexity he had no training for. Sophia was indeed awake, curled in the chair between the rooms with a coloring book someone had provided, though her attention was focused on the door to her mother's room rather than the crayons scattered across her lap. "Mr. Moretti," she said when she saw him, scrambling upright with the kind of nervous energy that suggested she'd been building up courage to ask questions. "Is Mama going to die?" The blunt directness of childhood that hadn't yet learned to soften difficult subjects with euphemism hit Dante in the chest, and he lowered himself into the chair beside her, carefully positioning his exhausted body at her level. "Your mama is very sick," he said honestly, unable to lie to this brave child who'd risked everything to save his wife. "But the doctors say she's responding well to treatment. She'll need to stay in the hospital for a while, maybe a week or 2, but they believe she'll recover." "And then what?" Sophia asked, her dark eyes studying his face with intensity that reminded him uncomfortably of himself at her age, already learning to read adults for signs of deception. We don't have anywhere to go. Mr. Richard fired Mama, and our apartment was connected to her job, so we can't go back there. And we don't have money for a new place. The practical concerns of a 7-year-old who'd already learned that survival required planning beyond the immediate crisis made something ache in Dante's chest. He'd grown up with similar calculations, understanding from too young an age that the world didn't provide safety nets for people like them. You don't need to worry about that, Dante said, his hand finding Sophia's, small one with gentleness that still felt foreign despite Eleanor's presence having taught him the value of kindness alongside strength. You saved Eleanor's life. You came to find me when you could have run, when you could have tried to handle this yourself or just disappeared into the system. That makes you family, Sophia. And I take care of family. But we're not really family, Sophia said, confusion evident in her small face. I heard Mama talking about the missing lady, about how you were still looking even after everyone said you should give up. And I thought maybe if I could find you, you'd save both of them. But that doesn't make us family. In my world, Dante said, choosing words carefully because Sophia deserved honesty even if Eleanor currently couldn't handle it. Family isn't just about blood. It's about loyalty and courage and being willing to risk everything for people who need help. You showed all of that when you found me at the gala. So yes, you're family now, which means you and your mother will have a home and money for school and doctors and protection from anyone who might try to hurt you. Sophia stared at him for a long moment, processing with the kind of careful assessment that children from difficult circumstances developed. Does that mean I have to do crimes? She asked finally, and Dante felt his mouth twitch toward a smile despite the exhaustion and emotional chaos of the past day. No, he said firmly. It means you get to be a kid. You get to go to school and make friends and not worry about whether there's food or if the bad men are coming. Your only job is to let yourself be 7 years old, which I'm guessing you haven't been able to do for a while. Tears filled Sophia's eyes, but she blinked them back with determination that was heartbreaking in someone so young. Thank you, she whispered, her arms suddenly around his neck in a hug that felt simultaneously natural and completely foreign to someone who'd spent 3 years avoiding any emotional connection that might distract from finding Eleanor. Teresa, the security specialist who'd been assigned to watch Sophia, appeared with lunch that included child-appropriate portions and options, her expression softening when she saw Dante holding the girl. They'd worked together for years, but she'd never seen him interact with children beyond the distant acknowledgement that they existed in proximity to his operations. Boss, Teresa said quietly, we have a situation developing that requires your attention. The Castellano family has hired a PR firm that's trying to spin this as a misunderstanding. They're claiming Richard was trying to help Eleanor, that she was being held by unknown parties, and he was attempting to negotiate her release. Rage spiked through Dante's exhaustion, hot and sharp and demanding action that would be satisfying but potentially counterproductive. He carefully disentangled himself from Sophia's embrace, ensuring she was settled with lunch before standing to face Teresa. Get me everything they're saying, Dante ordered, his voice dropping into the cold register that meant he was shifting from grieving husband and makeshift father figure into the calculating criminal who'd consolidated Boston's underworld through strategic brutality. Every interview, every press release, every social media statement. And then get me our media contacts. If they want a PR war, we'll give them one that destroys what's left of their reputation. The rest of the day blurred into a series of phone calls and strategic decisions, Dante coordinating responses from the hospital floor while refusing to leave despite his team's insistence that he could handle business from his office. Eleanor was sleeping again, the sedatives keeping her in a state that looked peaceful but was probably just chemical suppression of trauma that would resurface the moment the drugs wore off. Gabriella woke in the late afternoon, her fever broken, and awareness returning with the kind of disorientation that came from days of unconsciousness. Sophia was allowed into her mother's room under medical supervision, and Dante watched through the window as they reunited with tears and Spanish, words he couldn't understand but felt in his chest nonetheless. You're making quite the impression on that kid, Marcus observed, appearing beside him with coffee that was probably cold but would provide necessary caffeine regardless. "Teresa says Sophia's been asking when you're coming back, whether you meant what you said about them being family." "I meant it," Dante said, accepting the coffee with gratitude, even though it tasted like bitter disappointment. "She risked everything to tell me about Eleanor. That's not something I forget or dismiss when the crisis is over." "Boss," Marcus said carefully, in the tone that meant he was about to offer advice Dante wouldn't want to hear, "you need to think about what you're taking on here. Eleanor needs time to recover, time to process her trauma without the pressure of immediately stepping back into your world. And now you're adding a woman and child who have no connection to the business, who will need protection and resources and attention you might not be able to provide while managing Eleanor's recovery and the Castellano situation." "I know," Dante admitted, the weight of multiple responsibilities settling across his shoulders in ways that felt simultaneously crushing and oddly clarifying. "But walking away isn't an option. Not from Eleanor, not from Sophia and Gabriella. So I'll figure out how to manage all of it." What he didn't say, what he couldn't articulate even to Marcus, who knew him better than anyone, was that taking care of Sophia and Gabriella gave him purpose beyond the guilt and rage consuming him about Eleanor's captivity. It was concrete action he could take, problems he could solve, in contrast to Eleanor's trauma, which required patience and healing he had no training for. The evening brought Dr. Chin back with Gabriella's latest test results, her expression cautiously optimistic as she explained that the pneumonia was responding better than expected to aggressive antibiotic treatment. The lung damage was present but not as extensive as initial scans had suggested, and with proper care, Gabriella should regain most of her respiratory function. However, Dr. Chin added, her tone shifting to serious, Ms. Martinez has been asking questions about her situation, about the hospital bills, about long-term care costs, about what happens when she's discharged. I've explained that everything is being handled, but she's clearly uncomfortable accepting charity from someone she views as a stranger. She's not accepting charity, Dante said, moving toward Gabriella's room with determination that made Marcus sigh behind him. She's accepting payment for services rendered. Her daughter saved my wife's life. That's not a debt I can ever truly repay, but I can at least ensure they never worry about money or safety again. Gabriella was sitting up when he entered, her dark hair pulled back from a face that still carried fever's pallor but showed the intelligence that had kept her and Sophia alive through months of working for a monster. She watched Dante approach with wariness that was entirely justified given what she'd witnessed of Richard Castellano's capacity for violence. "Mr. Moretti," she said, her English accented but clear. "I need to understand what you expect from us in exchange for all of this." Her gesture encompassed the private room, the medical equipment, the level of care that was obviously far beyond what a housekeeper could normally afford. "Nothing," Dante said, pulling the visitor's chair closer to her bed and sitting with deliberate casualness meant to make himself less intimidating. "Your daughter saved the most important person in my life. There is no payment schedule for that kind of debt." "Everyone wants something," Gabriella said, still evident beneath her exhaustion. "I've worked for enough wealthy men to know that generosity always comes with strings attached. So tell me what you want from me and Sophia, and I'll decide if the price is worth what you're offering." The directness reminded him painfully of Eleanor, who'd never pretended to be comfortable with his criminal operations, but had chosen to marry him anyway with full awareness of what that decision meant. Honesty seemed like the only appropriate response to Gabriella's courage. "I want you to let me take care of you," Dante said simply. "A place to live that's safe and comfortable. Money for school and medical care and whatever Sophia needs to have a normal childhood. Protection from anyone who might come looking for revenge about what happened to Castellano. In exchange, all I ask is that you allow me to do these things without fighting me about accepting help." Gabriella studied him for a long moment, her gaze penetrating in ways that made him shift slightly despite years of practice maintaining composure under scrutiny. "You're the mob boss," she said finally, not a question but an observation that acknowledged reality both of them understood. "Sophia heard people at the hotel talking about you, about how the Moretti family controls half of Boston, how you're dangerous but honorable in your own way." "That's one interpretation," Dante said, unwilling to lie about who and what he was. Another interpretation is that I'm a criminal who happens to have a code about protecting people who don't deserve to be caught in the crossfire of this world. And which interpretation is correct? Gabriella asked. Probably both, Dante admitted. I'm not going to pretend I'm a good man, Ms. Martinez. But I am a man who pays his debts and protects his people. Your daughter made you my people when she found me at that gala. Gabriella's expression softened slightly, some of the defensive tension easing from her shoulders. Sophia talks about you like you're a superhero, she said quietly. Says you promised we'd be family, that we'd never have to be scared again. I need to know if those are promises you actually intend to keep, or if they were just words to comfort a frightened child. I keep my promises, Dante said, the words carrying weight of a vow that meant more in his world than any legal contract. Especially promises made to children who've already learned that adults can't always be trusted. Sophia will have every opportunity one can provide. You'll have financial security and protection, and neither of you will ever have reason to fear men like Richard Castellano again. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, Gabriella asking practical questions about housing and school districts, and whether Sophia would be pressured into the family business when she got older. Dante answered honestly, explaining that he wanted Sophia to have choices he'd never been given, that her future should be determined by her interests and talents rather than obligations to him. When he finally left Gabriella's room, he found Sophia had fallen asleep in the chair between the two doors, her small body curled uncomfortably, but her face peaceful in ways it probably hadn't been for months. Teresa had draped a blanket over her, and Dante paused to adjust it carefully before heading back to Eleanor's room. His wife was awake, staring at the ceiling with the kind of blank expression that suggested she was somewhere else entirely, probably back in that basement reliving trauma that would take years to process. Dante stood in the doorway, suddenly uncertain about whether his presence would be welcome or would trigger another panic attack. You can come in, Eleanor said without looking at him, her voice flat. I'm not going to fall apart again, or at least not immediately. Dante entered slowly, reading her body language for signs of the distress that had overwhelmed her earlier. But Eleanor seemed calmer now, exhausted but present in ways she hadn't been during their earlier conversation. I'm sorry, she said before he could speak. For earlier. For the way I reacted when you told me about what you did while I was gone. I asked for honesty, and then I punished you for providing it. You don't need to apologize, Dante said, settling into the chair beside her bed and resisting the urge to reach for her hand. You were right to be upset. The things I did, the people who died, that's not something you should have to accept or make peace with. But it's who you are, Eleanor said, finally turning to look at him with green eyes that held complicated emotions he couldn't fully parse. You were always dangerous, Dante. That's not something that changed because I was gone. I think I convinced myself that your violence had boundaries, that you wouldn't cross certain lines. And learning that those boundaries were more flexible than I believed she stopped, searching for words that would articulate the dissonance between the man she'd married and the man who'd spent 3 years becoming something darker. It's terrifying, she finished quietly, because if you could become that while looking for me, what happens now that I'm found? Do you go back to who you were before? Or is this the new normal? The question deserved consideration, not the immediate reassurance he wanted to offer. Dante thought about the past 3 years, about the power he'd consolidated and the fear his name now invoked across Boston's criminal landscape. Could he simply revert to his previous approach, the careful balance between violence and restraint that Eleanor had believed made him different from his father's generation? I don't know, he admitted, the honesty painful but necessary. I'd like to believe I can scale back, that finding you means I can return to operating with the boundaries I had before. But I'm not sure those boundaries ever really existed, Eleanor. I think maybe you just provided motivation to pretend they did. Eleanor's face crumpled slightly, tears escaping despite obvious attempts to maintain composure. I can't be the thing that determines whether you're a monster or just a man doing monstrous things. That's too much weight, Dante. I can't carry responsibility for your choices. You don't, Dante said fiercely, finally reaching for her hand despite uncertainty about whether the contact would be welcome. You never did. Every choice I made was mine. Every line I crossed was my decision. You were just the reason I bothered to care about where the lines were drawn. They sat in silence for a long moment, hands clasped but both lost in thoughts that probably weren't compatible, trying to find common ground in trauma that had affected them in fundamentally different ways. "I met Sophia's mother," Eleanor said finally, changing subjects with a kind of deliberate redirection that suggested she couldn't handle more heavy conversation about morality and violence. "Gabriella. She seems terrified of you." "Most people are," Dante said, appreciating the shift, even though he knew they'd need to return to the difficult conversations eventually. "But she's also grateful that Sophia found me. Sometimes fear and gratitude exist simultaneously." "Sophia adores you," Eleanor continued, a small smile touching her lips for the first time since he'd found her in that basement. "I could hear her through the wall, telling her mother about how you promised they'd be family, how you'd protect them from everything scary. She has complete faith in you, Dante. It's actually beautiful, seeing her trust someone so completely after what she's been through." The observation made Dante's chest tighten with emotions he still didn't have names for, pride and responsibility, and something that felt uncomfortably like love for a child he'd met less than 48 hours ago. "She reminds me of you," he said quietly. "The courage it took for her to find me, to trust a dangerous stranger with her most valuable information, that's the same kind of courage you showed when you agreed to marry into this life." Eleanor's expression softened, some of the distance between them diminishing. "I want to meet her properly. When I'm more myself. I'd like to thank her for being brave enough to save me when I couldn't save myself." "She'd like that," Dante said, feeling the first fragile threads of connection reforming between them. It wasn't the easy intimacy they'd shared before her disappearance, but it was something. A foundation they could potentially build on if they both survived the reconstruction process. The night deepened around them, Boston's lights visible through the hospital windows, and Dante finally allowed himself to feel the exhaustion that had been accumulating for over 3 years. Eleanor fell asleep holding his hand, and he stayed in the chair beside her bed, unwilling to leave even though his body was screaming for rest, for some kind of reprieve from the constant vigilance that had defined his existence since the moment she disappeared. Marcus appeared around midnight, his expression grim. "We have a problem," he said quietly, drawing Dante out into the hallway so they wouldn't disturb Eleanor. "The Castellano family has retained serious legal firepower. They're planning to argue that Richard was suffering from mental illness, that he wasn't responsible for his actions. The defense strategy is basically to paint him as a victim of his own psychological issues rather than a predator who consciously chose to kidnap and imprison women." The rage that information provoked was familiar, comfortable in ways Dante's softer emotions towards Sophia and Eleanor weren't. This was territory he understood, enemies who needed to be destroyed, problems that could be solved through strategic application of pressure and violence. "Get me everything on their legal team," Dante ordered, his voice dropping into the cold register that meant he was shifting fully into operational mode. "Every attorney, every expert witness they're planning to call, every angle they're preparing to exploit. And then start applying pressure. Nothing illegal that could compromise our position, but make sure every person involved in defending Castellano understands exactly who they're going up against." "Boss," Marcus said carefully, "this approach is going to attract attention. The kind of attention that might extend to Eleanor, to Sophia and Gabriella. The more visible you make this war with the Castellano family, the more likely it is that civilians in your orbit become targets." "Then we increase security," Dante said, refusing to back down from protecting what he just reclaimed. 24/7 details on everyone. This entire hospital floor is already locked down tighter than a federal prison. We extend that same level of protection to wherever they go after discharge. "That's not sustainable long-term," Marcus argued. "You can't keep Eleanor and 2 additional civilians in protective custody indefinitely. Eventually they're going to want normal lives, and maintaining that level of security while allowing freedom of movement is, I don't care what it costs or how complicated it is," Dante interrupted, his tone brooking no argument. "I lost Eleanor for 3 years because I underestimated how far Castellano would go. I'm not making that mistake again. Whatever it takes to keep them safe, that's what we do." Marcus sighed but nodded, recognizing when Dante had made a decision that wouldn't be changed through logic or practical concerns. They spent the next hour coordinating enhanced security protocols, discussing safe houses and transportation logistics, and the thousand small details that went into protecting people who'd become high-value targets simply by being connected to Dante Moretti. When Dante finally returned to Eleanor's room, he found Sophia had migrated from her chair to curl up at the foot of Eleanor's bed, her small body somehow having bypassed security to seek comfort from the woman she'd saved. Eleanor was awake, one hand resting protectively on Sophia's back, and her expression when she looked at Dante held something that looked almost like peace. "She had a nightmare," Eleanor whispered, "about men with guns coming to the hospital. Teresa tried to take her back to the chair, but I told her it was fine." Is that okay?" "I know I'm not. We're not. It's perfect," Dante said, his voice rough with emotions he couldn't name. The sight of his wife protecting a child who'd protected her, the two of them forming a unit that had nothing to do with him but everything to do with trauma and survival, and the fierce resilience that women developed when the world failed to keep them safe. It was almost too much to process after 3 years of rage and grief that had calcified into his entire identity. He settled into the chair, watching them both, and allowed himself to imagine a future where Eleanor recovered enough to reclaim her life, where Sophia grew up with opportunities and security, where the violence that defined his existence remained separate from the family that was somehow forming despite every reason it shouldn't work. It was foolish, probably impossible, but as dawn approached and the hospital floor remained secure around them, Dante let himself believe in possibilities he'd stopped allowing himself to consider. The war with the Castellano family was just beginning. The challenge of helping Eleanor heal would take years. The responsibility of caring for Sophia and Gabriella would require constant attention and resources. But sitting in that hospital room, watching the women who'd somehow become his entire world sleeping peacefully under his protection, Dante understood that he'd fight any battle, cross any line, destroy anyone who threatened this fragile new beginning. The protection wasn't just about Eleanor anymore. It had expanded to include a 7-year-old girl who'd shown more courage than most grown men, and her mother who'd risked everything to do the right thing. They were his now, whether they fully understood what that meant or not. And God help anyone who tried to take them from him. 3 months passed with the kind of slow healing that felt both insufficient and miraculous depending on which hour you asked. Eleanor had been discharged from the hospital after 2 weeks, but leaving the security of that controlled environment had triggered setbacks that required patience Dante didn't naturally possess. She'd wake screaming most nights, convinced she was back in that basement, and it took increasingly longer for her to recognize their bedroom in the penthouse he'd purchased specifically because it had 3 floors and enough space that Gabriella and Sophia could have their own wing while maintaining proximity that made Eleanor feel less isolated. The nightmares weren't the worst part. The worst part was watching Eleanor struggle with decisions that used to come naturally: what to wear, what to eat, whether to leave the apartment. 3 years of having every choice controlled had eroded her ability to trust her own judgment, and Dante found himself navigating a delicate balance between providing support and avoiding the kind of control that would reinforce her captivity's psychological damage. Sophia had adjusted better than anyone expected, her resilience a testament to youth's flexibility and the security of knowing that the terrifying uncertainty was over. She attended a private school 3 blocks from the penthouse, transported each day by a security detail that Sophia had named the uncles because calling them bodyguards made her classmates ask questions she didn't want to answer. She'd made friends quickly, her natural warmth and humor emerging now that fear wasn't her constant companion. Gabriella had been the surprise. After initial wariness about accepting Dante's help, she'd thrown herself into building a life that wasn't defined by survival. She'd enrolled in community college courses, studying business management, her sharp intelligence finally getting opportunities it deserved. She managed the household with quiet efficiency, providing stability that allowed Eleanor to focus on recovery without worrying about domestic logistics. They'd become a strange approximation of family, linked not by blood but by trauma and rescue and the complicated obligation that came from lives being saved. The penthouse that Dante had purchased as a fortress against the world had transformed into something that occasionally felt like a home, though none of them would have claimed normalcy described their situation. The Castellano situation had escalated exactly as Marcus had predicted. Richard's defense team was constructing an elaborate insanity plea, hiring expert witnesses who testified about psychological breaks and diminished capacity. The media had divided into camps, those who believed the evidence of kidnapping and imprisonment, and those who preferred the narrative that old money families were being persecuted by nouveau riche criminals with grudges. Dante had spent 3 months systematically dismantling the Castellano family's reputation and financial foundation. Property deals that had seemed secure collapsed under scrutiny that revealed building code violations and environmental contamination. Business partnerships dissolved when evidence surfaced of fraud and money laundering. Board positions were quietly eliminated through pressure Dante applied to people who owed him favors or feared his retribution. It was the kind of comprehensive destruction that took patience and resources, but Dante had both in abundance. The Castellanos were bleeding money on legal fees and settlements, their social standing eroding as former allies distanced themselves from the scandal. Richard himself remained in federal custody, bail repeatedly denied as prosecutors added charges based on evidence that kept mysteriously appearing. But revenge, Dante was discovering, felt hollow when the person he'd been avenging was struggling to leave her bedroom some days. Eleanor's recovery wasn't linear. Good days were followed by setbacks that made him want to resurrect Castellano just to kill him again more slowly. The breaking point came on a Thursday afternoon in early May. Dante had taken a rare day away from business operations to spend time with Eleanor, hoping that his presence would help ground her during what the therapist called triggering anniversaries. 3 years and 2 months since her kidnapping, a milestone that Eleanor had been dreading for weeks. They were in the penthouse's living room, enormous windows overlooking Boston Harbor, when Eleanor suddenly stood from the couch with jerky movements that suggested she was operating on autopilot rather than conscious thought. "I need to leave," she said, her voice high and tight with panic. I can't be inside anymore. The walls are Dante, I can't breathe." He was moving before she finished speaking, grabbing his phone to alert Marcus, while simultaneously guiding Eleanor toward the private elevator. She was shaking violently, her breathing accelerating into hyperventilation territory, and Dante felt helpless in ways that being unable to find her for 3 years hadn't prepared him for. At least searching had been action. This required patience and gentleness that didn't come naturally to someone whose problems usually responded to strategic violence. "We're going outside," he said, keeping his voice steady through effort that cost more than any negotiation. "Right now. You're going to feel the sun and the air, and you're going to remember that you're not trapped." The elevator descended with agonizing slowness, Eleanor's panic attack intensifying with each floor that passed. By the time they reached ground level, she was sobbing, her small body racked with tremors that made supporting her weight difficult despite Dante's strength. Marcus met them in the lobby with 3 other security personnel, his expression grim but unsurprised. They drilled for this scenario, Eleanor's trauma manifesting in ways that required immediate evacuation, but practicing hadn't prepared Dante for the reality of his wife's complete psychological collapse. They got her to the park 2 blocks away, the open space and spring sunshine doing more to calm her nervous system than anything Dante had said. Eleanor sat on a bench with her face turned toward the sun, eyes closed, breathing gradually slowing to something approaching normal. "I'm sorry," she whispered after 10 minutes of silence. "I know I'm trying, Dante. I'm really trying to be normal again." "You don't need to be normal," Dante said, the words emerging rougher than intended. "You need to heal, which doesn't happen on a schedule or according to what anyone else thinks you should be capable of." Eleanor opened her eyes, tears tracking down her cheeks in patterns that made something crack in Dante's chest. "I can't live like this," she said quietly. "I can't spend the rest of my life afraid of rooms that remind me of that basement. I can't keep having panic attacks that require security details to manage. I'm not the person you married, Dante. I don't know if I'll ever be her again." The admission hung between them, heavy with implications neither wanted to examine too closely. Dante had been avoiding this conversation since her rescue, unwilling to acknowledge that Eleanor might be fundamentally changed by captivity, that the woman he'd married might not exist anymore in any meaningful sense. "Then we figure out who you are now," Dante said, forcing himself to articulate words he'd been avoiding. "The woman I married was brave and fierce and refused to let my world break her. You're still brave, Eleanor. Still fierce. The fact that you survived 3 years of that hell proves it. Maybe you're different now, but different doesn't mean broken." "I feel broken," Eleanor whispered, her hand finding his with a kind of desperate grip that communicated need more clearly than words. I feel like Castellano shattered something essential, and I'm just pieces trying to hold together long enough to convince everyone I'm whole. Sophia's voice cut through the moment, high and excited. Eleanor, Mr. Dante, look what I made in art class. The girl was running toward them with a security guard trailing behind, her backpack bouncing against her small back and a large piece of construction paper clutched in both hands. She skidded to a stop in front of the bench, breathless and beaming, completely oblivious to the emotional crisis she'd interrupted. It's our family, Sophia announced, presenting the artwork with pride that was infectious despite its objectively crude execution. 4 stick figures stood in front of a building that was supposed to be the penthouse, each labeled in careful 7-year-old printing. That's you and Eleanor and Mama and me. Ms. Rodriguez said we should draw pictures of people who make us feel safe, so I drew all of you. Eleanor's expression transformed, tears now falling for entirely different reasons as she accepted the drawing with trembling hands. Sophia, this is beautiful, she said, her voice thick but genuine. Can I keep it? Of course. Sophia climbed onto the bench between them, her small body warm and solid and completely trusting. You can put it on the refrigerator like normal families do. Mama says we're an unusual family, but I think unusual is better than boring. Dante felt something shift in his chest, watching Eleanor clutch a child's drawing like it was precious beyond measure, Sophia chattering about her day with the kind of innocent joy that both of them had been missing. They did look like a family in Sophia's artwork. Unconventional certainly, built on trauma and obligation rather than conventional bonds, but family nonetheless. Sophia's right, Dante said quietly, his arms settling around Eleanor's shoulders with careful pressure. Unusual is definitely better than boring. The moment was shattered by Marcus's voice in his earpiece, tension evident even through the electronic transmission. Boss, we have a situation. Castellano's defense team just filed a motion for immediate release based on new psychiatric evaluation. Judge is considering it. Rage spiked through Dante's carefully maintained calm, hot and sharp and demanding immediate action. Eleanor felt him tense, her own body responding with the kind of hypervigilance that trauma had trained into her nervous system. What's wrong? She asked, pulling back to study his face with eyes that had learned to read his moods through years of marriage and 3 years of wondering if he'd ever find her. Castellano might be released, Dante said, unable to soften the information despite knowing how it would impact her fragile stability. His lawyers found some psychiatrist willing to testify that he's not a flight risk and that continued detention is damaging his mental health. Eleanor's face went white, all the progress of the past hour evaporating instantly. No, she whispered, the word barely audible. No, Dante, he can't. If he gets out, he'll come for me. He told me every day that if I was ever found, if I ever escaped, he'd make sure I regretted it. He won't touch you, Dante interrupted, his voice dropping into the cold register that meant he was shifting from husband into the enforcer who'd consolidated Boston's underworld through calculated brutality. I promise you, Eleanor, Richard Castellano will never get close enough to hurt you again. Sophia was watching them with wide eyes, her child's instinct recognizing adult fear even if she didn't understand its source. Dante forced himself to moderate his intensity, unwilling to frighten the girl who'd become impossibly important to him over the past 3 months. Eleanor needs to go back to the penthouse, he said to Marcus through the earpiece while maintaining eye contact with his wife. Full lockdown protocols. No one in or out without my personal authorization. And get me everything on this judge. Every case he's presided over, every connection he has to the Castellano family, every pressure point we can exploit. The return to the penthouse happened with military efficiency, security forming a protective barrier that made other park visitors stare but kept Eleanor and Sophia insulated from potential threats. Gabriella met them at the entrance, her expression concerned as she took in Eleanor's pallor and the tension radiating from Dante. Take Sophia upstairs, Dante said quietly to Gabriella. Eleanor needs some time, and I need to handle some business that's probably not appropriate for children to witness. Gabriella nodded, understanding more than he'd articulated, and guided Sophia away despite the girl's protests about wanting to stay with Eleanor. The elevator ride up to the penthouse was silent, Eleanor's hand crushing Dante's with strength that would have been impressive if it wasn't communicating absolute terror. "Tell me honestly," Eleanor said once they were alone in the penthouse's master bedroom, her back against the door like she was barricading them inside. "Can he actually get out? Can his family's money buy his freedom even after what he did?" "Not if I have anything to say about it," Dante said, pulling out his phone and beginning to make calls that would mobilize resources he'd spent years cultivating specifically for situations where legal systems failed. "But Eleanor, I need you to understand something. If he does get released, if somehow his lawyers manage to manipulate the system, you'll kill him," Eleanor finished, her voice flat. "That's what you're not saying. That if the courts fail, you'll take justice into your own hands." "Yes," Dante said, refusing to lie about intentions that were probably written clearly across his face. "I'll kill him, and I'll do it in a way that ensures he suffers appropriately for what he did to you." Eleanor stared at him for a long moment, emotions warring across her features too quickly for him to track. "I should tell you not to," she said finally. "I should say that revenge won't heal me, that violence only perpetuates cycles of harm. That's what Dr. Matthews says in our sessions. That real recovery requires me to release the rage and focus on rebuilding." "But," Dante prompted, hearing the unspoken contradiction in her tone. "But I want him dead," Eleanor whispered, the admission seeming to cost her something essential. "I want him to suffer the way he made me suffer. I want him to know that taking me was the biggest mistake of his life, and I want to watch when he realizes that your love for me was his death sentence. Does that make me a monster?" "No," Dante said, crossing to her and framing her face with hands that had inflicted more violence than he could quantify. "It makes you human. It makes you someone who survived hell and has every right to want the devil who put you there to face consequences." They stood like that for a heartbeat, foreheads pressed together, breathing each other's air in the kind of intimate proximity that felt simultaneously familiar and foreign after everything that had changed between them. "I need to make some calls," Dante said finally, pulling back with reluctance that surprised him. "Stay here with security. Don't leave the penthouse for any reason. I'll update you as soon as I know what's happening with the judge's decision." The next 6 hours blurred into a frenzy of activity that reminded Dante why he'd consolidated power so ruthlessly over the past 3 years. The judge considering Castellano's release had connections to the family through his wife's social circle, a conflict of interest that should have required recusal but apparently wasn't being disclosed. Dante's legal team filed emergency motions highlighting the bias, while his less official operatives began applying pressure through channels that existed entirely outside courtroom procedures. By midnight, the judge had reversed his decision, citing additional evidence provided by prosecutors about Castellano's danger to witnesses. The defense team was threatening appeals, but for now, Richard remained in federal custody where Dante's reach was limited but not entirely absent. Marcus found him in the penthouse's office at 2 a.m, exhaustion evident in posture that usually maintained military precision. "It's handled for now," Marcus said, accepting the bourbon Dante poured without comment on whether drinking at this hour was advisable. "But boss, this is going to keep happening. The Castellano family has resources and connections that won't quit just because we won this round. Eventually, they're going to find a pressure point we can't defend against." "Then we eliminate the threat permanently," Dante said, the words emerging with finality that made Marcus's expression shift into concern. "You want to order a hit on a man in federal custody?" Marcus asked carefully. "That's, boss, that crosses lines that even you have avoided. The kind of heat that brings down isn't manageable through our usual channels." "I don't care," Dante said, though part of him recognized the truth in Marcus's warning. "I can't. I won't spend the rest of Eleanor's life waiting for Castellano to find some legal loophole or family connection that gets him released. She'll never heal if she's constantly afraid he's coming back for her." "There might be another option," Marcus said slowly, in the tone that meant he was about to suggest something Dante would initially hate. "What if we make him irrelevant instead of dead? What if we destroy the Castellano family so completely that even if Richard gets out, he has nothing? No money, no power, no resources to threaten anyone." The suggestion had merit that Dante couldn't immediately dismiss, despite his preference for permanent solutions. Keep talking. Marcus outlined a strategy that would take months but promised comprehensive destruction of the Castellano empire. Real estate holdings could be seized through environmental lawsuits that the family couldn't afford to fight while paying Richard's legal fees. Business partnerships could be dissolved through pressure on associates who depended on Moretti goodwill. Social standing could be annihilated through strategic leaks about family scandals that had been carefully concealed for generations. By the time we're done, Marcus said, Richard Castellano will be a broken man from a disgraced family with no resources to threaten a stray cat, let alone mount any kind of revenge campaign against Eleanor. It was comprehensive, ruthless, and had the advantage of not requiring Dante to orchestrate a hit that could bring federal investigations crashing down on operations he'd spent years building. But it also meant leaving Castellano alive, which felt like incomplete justice for what Eleanor had endured. Do it, Dante said finally. But Marcus, if at any point it looks like he might actually get released before we've destroyed his foundation completely, we move to permanent solutions regardless of the consequences. Eleanor's safety takes priority over everything, including my freedom. The campaign against the Castellano family launched the next morning with precision that would have impressed military strategists. Every pressure point Marcus had identified was exploited simultaneously, creating chaos that prevented the family from mounting coordinated defense. The media, fed carefully curated leaks about decades of fraud and corruption, turned the story from wealthy family persecuted into criminal dynasty finally facing justice. Eleanor watched the news coverage with complicated emotions, relief mixing with something that looked like guilt as the Castellano family's carefully constructed image collapsed under scrutiny that revealed right beneath the veneer of respectability. "They're being destroyed because of me," she said one evening as they watched a news report about the family's real estate empire being seized by environmental regulators. "Children who had nothing to do with Richard's crimes are losing their homes because I was kidnapped." "They're being destroyed because their family chose to protect a predator," Dante corrected, unwilling to let Eleanor take responsibility for consequences that belonged entirely to the Castellanos. Any family that would hire lawyers to defend kidnapping and imprisonment has already made moral choices that deserve these outcomes. Sophia appeared in the doorway, her small face serious, in ways that reminded Dante uncomfortably that children absorbed more than adults wanted to believe. "Is the bad man going to stay in jail?" she asked with a directness that made adults uncomfortable, but Dante appreciated for its honesty. "Yes," Dante said, making the promise despite not having complete control over judicial outcomes. "Mr. Richard is going to stay locked up where he can't hurt anyone ever again." "Good," Sophia said with satisfaction that was slightly chilling in someone so young. "Because Eleanor was crying in the bathroom earlier, and Mama said it's because she's still scared. And I don't like when Eleanor is scared because it makes my stomach feel weird." The observation that a 7-year-old could articulate Eleanor's emotional state when Dante had been trying to convince himself she was managing fine landed with uncomfortable accuracy. He'd been so focused on external threats and legal maneuvers that he'd perhaps not been paying enough attention to Eleanor's internal struggle. After Sophia was tucked into bed with a story that Gabriella read in Spanish while Dante listened from the doorway, he found Eleanor on the penthouse's balcony, staring at Boston's lights with expression that suggested she was seeing something entirely different from the city spread before her. "Sophia said you were crying," Dante said, joining her at the railing with careful distance that allowed her to close the gap if she wanted or maintain space if she needed it. "Sophia has excellent observational skills," Eleanor said with weak humor that didn't reach her eyes. "You should recruit her for intelligence operations when she's older." "That's not funny," Dante said, though he heard the deflection for what it was. "Talk to me, Eleanor. Really talk to me about what's happening in your head." Eleanor was silent for so long he thought she might not answer, but finally she spoke with voice that trembled despite obvious efforts at control. "I feel like I'm drowning, Dante. Like everyone is so focused on revenge and justice and protecting me from external threats that no one's noticing I'm disappearing inside my own trauma. The therapist says I need to process what happened, need to move through the grief and rage to reach acceptance, but how am I supposed to do that when you're literally destroying an entire family because of what one man did to me?" "So you want me to stop?" Dante asked, genuinely uncertain about what answer he was hoping for. "You want me to let Castellano's lawyers argue for his release without fighting back?" "No," Eleanor said immediately, then reconsidered. Maybe. I don't know. I want. She stopped, frustration evident in the way her hands clenched the railing. I want to not be the reason for violence anymore. I want to make decisions about my own life instead of being the prize people fight over. I want to feel like a person again instead of a symbol of everything you lost and found. The words landed like blows, each one accurate in ways Dante couldn't defend against. He had been treating Eleanor's rescue as validation of his 3-year campaign, as proof that his refusal to give up had been justified. But somewhere in that narrative, he perhaps stopped seeing her as an autonomous person and started seeing her as evidence of his loyalty and love. Tell me what you need, Dante said, the question feeling simultaneously too large and too simple for the complexity of their situation. Not what you think I want to hear, or what will make things easier. What do you actually need to start healing? Eleanor turned to face him fully, tears streaming down her face in patterns that carved trails through careful makeup she'd applied that morning in an attempt to look normal. I need to testify, she said, the words emerging with strength that seemed to surprise her. I need to stand in court and tell everyone what Castellano did to me. Not have lawyers speak for me, or have you fight this battle on my behalf. I need to face him and let him see that he didn't break me. Eleanor, no, Dante said immediately, the refusal automatic despite recognizing her need for agency. Testifying means exposing you to cross-examination designed to destroy your credibility. It means his lawyers will try to paint you as unreliable or complicit or anything that creates reasonable doubt. It means I get to take back power that was stolen from me, Eleanor interrupted with more passion than he'd heard from her since the rescue. It means I'm not hiding behind your protection or letting fear control my choices. You asked what I need, Dante. This is what I need. To stand in that courtroom and make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of monster Richard Castellano is. The conviction in her voice made arguments die on Dante's tongue despite every instinct screaming that exposing Eleanor to that kind of scrutiny was dangerous and potentially re-traumatizing. But Marcus's words from months ago echoed in his memory. Eleanor needed agency, needed to make choices about her own life, even if those choices were ones Dante would never make for her. Okay, he said finally, the word feeling like surrender despite being exactly what Eleanor needed to hear. Okay, we'll contact the prosecutors and let them know you want to testify. But on one condition. What condition? Eleanor asked warily. You work with the prosecutor and your therapist to prepare, Dante said. You don't go into that courtroom until you're as ready as possible for what defense lawyers will try to do. And if at any point it becomes too much, if testifying is causing more harm than healing, you can change your mind without any judgment from me. Eleanor nodded, relief and terror warring across her features in ways that made Dante want to pull her close and promise that he'd fix everything without requiring her participation. But that instinct was exactly what she was fighting against, the need to prove she could face her demons, rather than letting Dante eliminate them on her behalf. The next 2 months were intense with preparation that felt more grueling than Dante's most complex operations. Eleanor met with prosecutors 3 times weekly, walking through her testimony and being subjected to practice cross-examinations that left her shaking and exhausted. Her therapist doubled their sessions, helping Eleanor develop coping mechanisms for managing trauma responses while reliving the worst experiences of her captivity. Sophia became Eleanor's unlikely anchor during this time, her childish demands for attention and affection providing relief from constant trial preparation. They baked cookies that turned out slightly burned, watched animated movies that Sophia insisted were educational, and took walks in the park with security, forming discreet perimeter that allowed illusion of normalcy. Sophia makes me remember how to be happy about small things, Eleanor told Dante one evening after putting the girl to bed with promises about tomorrow's adventure to the aquarium. When I'm with her, I can focus on joy instead of just surviving. She reminds me that life has good parts too. The trial began on a Tuesday in late July, humidity making Boston feel like a pressure cooker and tensions running high enough that Dante had double security around everyone in his orbit. The courtroom was packed with media and curious observers, all eager to witness the spectacle of a prominent family's downfall. Richard Castellano looked diminished in prison jumpsuit, his expensive suits replaced by orange fabric that stripped away the veneer of respectability. But his eyes when they landed on Eleanor held malice that made Dante's hands curl into fists, rage spiking so intensely that Marcus had to put a restraining hand on his shoulder. Eleanor's testimony was devastating in its clinical precision. She described her kidnapping, the basement prison, the years of captivity without dramatics or embellishment. Her voice remained steady even when describing psychological torture, when explaining how Castellano had systematically broken down her sense of reality until she couldn't trust her own perceptions. The defense's cross-examination was brutal as expected, lawyers trying to imply that Eleanor had been having an affair with Castellano, that her captivity had been consensual arrangement that she later regretted. They suggested that her testimony was motivated by desire for Dante's money and revenge rather than truth. Eleanor handled each insinuation with dignity that made Dante simultaneously proud and furious that she had to defend herself against victim blaming that had no basis in evidence. When the defense attorney suggested that Eleanor could have escaped if she truly wanted to, that her continued imprisonment suggested compliance, Eleanor's composure cracked for the first time. "I tried to escape 14 times, she said, her voice shaking but clear. 14 times I found what I thought might be opportunities, and 14 times I failed. The last attempt resulted in injuries that took 6 weeks to heal without medical care. You ask why I didn't keep trying? Because eventually you learn that surviving means accepting limitations, even when those limitations feel like death." The courtroom went silent, the weight of her words settling over everyone with crushing finality. Even Castellano's lawyers seemed momentarily at loss for how to count her testimony, delivered with such raw honesty. The verdict came after 3 days of deliberation that felt eternal. Guilty on all counts: kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment, assault, and a dozen other charges that would ensure Richard Castellano spent the rest of his life in federal prison without possibility of parole. Eleanor collapsed in the hallway outside the courtroom, her legs giving out as adrenaline that had sustained her through testimony finally crashed. Dante caught her before she hit the floor, lifting her into his arms while security formed protective barrier against media trying to capture the moment. "You did it," he murmured against her hair, carrying her toward the private exit his team had secured. "You faced him and you won." "I can't feel my legs," Eleanor said with laugh that bordered on hysteria. "Is that normal? Should I be able to feel my legs?" "It's the adrenaline crash," Dante said, though he was already barking. "Orders to Marcus about getting a doctor to meet them at the penthouse. You just testified against the man who held you prisoner for 3 years. I'd be worried if you weren't having physical reactions." They made it to the car without incident, security hustling them away from the courthouse before media could fully mobilize. Eleanor shook violently in the back seat, her breathing erratic but not quite hitting panic attack territory. "I need to see Sophia," Eleanor said suddenly. Dante, I need to hold her and remember that good things exist. That children can trust adults and survive scary situations and still laugh about silly things. Please, I need to see Sophia." The request was granted immediately, their convoy redirecting toward the penthouse where Gabriella was watching Sophia after school. They arrived to find the girl doing homework at the dining table, her small face scrunched in concentration over math problems that were apparently very serious. Sophia looked up when they entered, her expression transforming from studious concentration to joy, so pure it hurt to witness. "Eleanor, did you win? Did you make the bad man go to jail forever?" "Yes," Eleanor said, dropping to her knees and opening her arms. Sophia crashed into the embrace with enthusiasm that nearly knocked Eleanor over, small arms wrapping tight around her neck. "I won. He's going to jail forever." "I'm proud of you," Sophia said seriously, pulling back to look at Eleanor with eyes that held more wisdom than 7 years should provide. "Mama says being brave isn't about not being scared. It's about doing scary things, even when you want to hide. You were very brave today." Eleanor's face crumpled, tears falling freely now that she was in safe space with people who loved her rather than strangers judging every word. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for being the bravest person I know and showing me that courage is possible even when everything is terrifying." Dante watched them from the doorway, Gabriella appearing beside him with expression that suggested she understood exactly what was happening. 2 people who'd survived trauma finding solace in each other's resilience. "They're good for each other," Gabriella said quietly. Sophia has been lighter since Eleanor started letting her help with small things. And Eleanor, she's different when Sophia's around. More present, more connected to life instead of just surviving through it. I noticed, Dante said, something shifting in his chest as he watched his wife and the child who'd saved her creating their own recovery through connection that had nothing to do with his protection or resources. That evening, after Sophia was asleep and Gabriella had retired to her wing of the penthouse, Dante found Eleanor on the balcony again, but this time her posture was different, less defeated, more contemplative. I think I'm going to be okay, she said when he joined her. Not today, probably not for a long time, but eventually, I think I'm going to be okay. Because of the verdict? Dante asked. Because I stood up, Eleanor said, turning to face him with expression that held something approaching peace. Because I stopped letting fear control my choices, and I did the terrifying thing anyway. Because Sophia showed me that surviving trauma doesn't mean you're broken forever. It means you're strong enough to keep building a life, even when the foundation is shaky. She reached for his hand, their fingers intertwining with familiarity that felt both comfortable and new. I know I haven't been easy these past months. I know my trauma has been difficult for you to navigate while trying to fix everything through the only means you know, power and control and eliminating threats. You don't need to apologize for, Dante started, but Eleanor squeezed his hand, silencing him. I'm not apologizing, she said firmly. I'm explaining. You saved me, Dante. Not just from that basement, but from believing I'd been forgotten. But I need you to understand that I'm not a problem you can solve through strategy or violence. I'm a person who needs to rebuild herself through her own choices, even when those choices are scary or seem counterproductive to you. I know, Dante said, the admission costing more than he'd expected. Or I'm learning. I'm used to fixing problems, not accepting that some things require patience and allowing people to heal at their own pace. Can you do that? Eleanor asked, vulnerability evident beneath the strength she'd demonstrated in court. Can you be patient with my recovery, even when it's frustrating? Can you love me when I'm different from the woman you married? I already love you when you're different, Dante said, pulling her close with desperate need to communicate what words felt inadequate to express. I love you more now than I did before, if that's possible. Because I've seen exactly how strong you are, how much courage it takes to keep fighting when surrender would be easier. You're not less than who you were before. You're more. You're everything. They stood like that for a long moment, holding each other while Boston's lights glittered around them and the future stretched ahead with uncertainty that felt less terrifying than it had months ago. The months that followed brought changes that transformed their strange household into something that felt increasingly like family. Eleanor began volunteering at organizations that helped trafficking survivors, using her experience to provide perspective that professional counselors couldn't match. Sophia continued thriving in school, her natural intelligence and warmth making her popular despite the security detail that marked her as different. Gabriella completed her business degree and began consulting for Dante's legitimate restaurants, her hospitality experience and sharp mind improving operations in ways that justified the generous salary he paid her. The arrangement provided her with career advancement while keeping her close enough that Sophia's routine remained stable. Dante himself began the slow process of extracting himself from the more violent aspects of his operations, delegating enforcement to trusted lieutenants while focusing on legitimate businesses that Eleanor could feel comfortable about. It wasn't redemption exactly. He'd done too much to ever claim clean hands, but it was evolution toward something that felt more sustainable long-term. One evening in early December, nearly a year after Sophia had whispered those impossible words at the gala, Dante found himself watching Eleanor teach Sophia to bake cookies while Christmas music played from speakers that Sophia had insisted on programming with happy songs. Gabriella was reviewing restaurant financials at the dining table, her reading glasses perched on her nose and expression focused. Sophia was covered in flour, giggling as Eleanor demonstrated proper measuring technique with exaggerated seriousness. The penthouse smelled of cinnamon and vanilla, and for a moment, Dante allowed himself to simply exist in this space they created together. Mr. Dante, Sophia called, noticing him in the doorway. Come help. We're making cookies for everyone in the building because Eleanor says Christmas is about sharing with neighbors. Even the ones who complained about your security team taking up parking spaces? Dante asked with amusement, moving to join them. Especially them, Eleanor said, her smile genuine in ways it hadn't been a year ago. Because Sophia's right, unusual families are better than boring ones, and unusual families definitely bake cookies for grumpy neighbors at Christmas. Dante joined them at the counter. Accepting the wooden spoon, Sophia thrust at him with instruction to mix vigorously, and felt something settle in his chest that had been restless for longer than he could remember. This wasn't the life he'd imagined when he built his empire through calculated violence and strategic intimidation. But it was better, messier, more complicated, and infinitely more valuable than anything he'd accumulated before. "I love you," he said to Eleanor, the words emerging naturally despite years of being carefully controlled with emotional expression. "All of you. This whole strange family we've built. I love this more than anything." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling as she reached up to kiss him, flower-covered hands leaving prints on his expensive shirt that he didn't care about even slightly. "We love you too," she whispered. "Even when you're overprotective and controlling and still figuring out how to be soft sometimes." "I'm working on the soft part," Dante said, looking at Sophia, who was now attempting to steal cookie dough when she thought no one was watching. "Though I may need more practice." "We have time," Eleanor said, leaning against him with comfort that had taken months to rebuild. "And patience. And a 7-year-old who's determined that you learn to braid hair properly because the security team's attempts are apparently embarrassing at school drop-off." The cookies turned out slightly lopsided and imperfectly decorated, but they distributed them to neighbors anyway, Sophia's enthusiasm making even the grumpiest residents smile despite themselves. Standing in their penthouse later that night, watching Sophia sleep peacefully in the bed that had replaced her temporary accommodations, Dante felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope, not the desperate, grasping hope of searching for someone lost, but the quiet confidence that came from knowing that tomorrow would come and they'd face it together. Whatever challenges remained, whatever trauma still needed processing, whatever complications arose from his past or their present, they'd navigate it as family. Eleanor appeared beside him, her hand finding his with automatic intimacy that spoke of rebuilding trust one moment at a time. "She asked me today if we could officially adopt her," Eleanor said quietly. "Said that Gabriella would always be her mother, but she wants us to be her parents too. She wants to make it official that she belongs with us." Dante felt his throat tighten with emotions he still didn't have complete vocabulary for. "What did you say?" "I said we'd talk to you," Eleanor answered, leaning her head against his shoulder. "But Dante, I want this. I want her to be ours officially. I want to give her the security of knowing that even if something happened to Gabriella, she'd still have us. She saved my life. The least I can do is ensure she knows she'll always have a home." "Then we'll do it," Dante said, the decision feeling monumental and completely natural simultaneously. "We'll make it legal. Sophia Martinez Moretti. She can keep her mother's name and add ours. She deserves that recognition of what she means to this family." They stood together watching Sophia sleep, this brave child who'd somehow saved them all through courage that children shouldn't need to possess, but that had changed everything. Outside, Boston glittered with Christmas lights and the promise of a new year approaching. Inside, a family that shouldn't work, built on trauma and rescue, an obligation that had transformed into genuine love, prepared to make official what had been true for months. They weren't a conventional family, but unusual, as Sophia had observed, was definitely better than boring. And this unusual family that had formed through collision and crisis and courage was everything Dante had never known he needed until a little girl whispered impossible words that became his salvation. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.